We've been incredibly slow to catch up with the United States and even Australia, which introduced a similar act in order to deal with Chinese influence and interference there. And in fact, in Australia, they've established something called the Counter Foreign Interference Coordinator's Office. This has become a bit of a plague. And in fact, it's not just China, as we know. Russia's heavily involved in this, Iran, arguably, other countries. And we've got to get our act together. We've got to coordinate the way in which we protect our economy and our democracy from these kind of threats. And at the moment, we're clearly not doing so.
Let's now talk to Christopher Steele, who's a former British intelligence officer with MI6. Hello to you, Christopher.
Hello, John.
Tell me, what are your feelings now about the potential threat from China and how well or badly equipped we are to deal with it?
I think it's quite a pervasive threat because actually this is not, as has been painted by some in the media, a sort of classic espionage case. This guy is an agent of influence in intelligence parlance, which means that his job is actually to operate almost in the open, but to come to Britain and to try and influence our legislation, to try and find out what's going on in the Chinese emigre community here and our academic system. And I think this threat is quite pervasive, as I say. The other thing is we've never really come to terms with how we should engage with China. On the one hand, we have to do business with them because they're such a big power, trading partner. They're important in things like climate change and pandemics. But on the security side, we've been slow to catch up with the sort of legislation that we need. We've had a couple of acts of Parliament pass recently, the National Security Act itself and the National Security Investment Act. But clearly we're rather behind the curve still.
Right. So in an ideal world, how should these relationships with people in government, with people in Buckingham Palace, and someone like an agent of influence, as you describe him or her, how should that be regulated and changed?
I think a lot of it is making the public actually aware of these threats, because somebody like this that's operating pretty much in the open isn't immediately taken to be some kind of security threat, even though actually what they're trying to do is quite profound. As I've said before, the student community in China, the United Front Work Department from which this guy stems, is not an intelligence agency, but it is a sort of forward leaning influence operation, and it has intelligence coming behind it, targeting of people and possibly identifying people to become agents. But in general, this influence, this interference, I would say, is pretty profound, and it's affecting large parts of our civil society, not just government, including Parliament, as we've seen with some of the indictments in the last couple of years, but also academia, where self-censorship about China is being enforced. And this is all part of their agenda under Xi Jinping.
Right. So when and if we get, and we're told we will get one, a register of people acting in the service of a foreign power, especially a potentially adversarial power like China, how should that register be used? Does it mean blocking access to people at the top of government? Does it mean blocking access to members of the royal family who don't have the same sort of influence or use it in the same sort of way?
I think it's difficult to generalize. The way this works in the United States is quite effective because it effectively makes it transparent which lobbyists and which organizations are working for whom. And we've been incredibly slow to catch up with the United States and even Australia, which introduced a similar act in order to deal with Chinese influence and interference there. And in fact, in Australia, they've established something called the Counter Foreign Interference Coordinator's Office. This has become a bit of a plague. And in fact, it's not just China, as we know. Russia's heavily involved in this, Iran, arguably, other countries. And we've got to get our act together. We've got to coordinate the way in which we protect our economy and our democracy from these kind of threats. And at the moment, we're clearly not doing so.
Right. So I guess there's a distinction then, or a potential distinction between people who use their influence in political or business circles and those who are actively engaged in spying, whether it's industrial espionage or whatever kind of espionage it is. And you say we're not doing enough about that. We're not well enough protected. What does that mean? What should we be doing that we're not doing?
I think sensitizing both politicians and the public to this threat, I think that's one of the big problems we've got. And secondly, making sure that an example is made at the top. If you look at the registration of parliamentary interest, particularly for the House of Lords, it's not adequately making transparent these kind of relationships. And that's clearly a problem when it comes to things like legislation. The other thing that's made out is that ministerial appointments after office are not also sort of taken into account here, that decisions in government could be affected by a minister's potential wish to get employed in the private sector after office, and possibly in connection with China or as it was in the day, Russia. So I think there's a lot of work to be done here, and the threat itself needs to be properly understood, but we have to have a measured response. It's no good sort of saying sweepingly, this is Chinese spying or espionage, whatever. That's unproven. But what the United Front Work Department is quite openly is a massive influence operation, and those influences are not necessarily in our national interest.
Are we always going to be vulnerable to China, given that we look to China for investment as a business partner, as a trading partner?
Sure, but I think the relationship should still be manageable as long as these things are made transparent. And at the moment, as I say, from the top down, including the House of Lords interest register, this is not transparent. Once it's made transparent, once the threat from China is realized, the Chinese respect strength. And they see that in places like America, which has a Foreign Agent Registration Act that's been in operation for decades. And they don't really see that here. And of course, we had this so-called golden age under David Cameron. And a lot of these problems, I suspect, stem from that. China's changed under Xi Jinping. It is much more of a threat than it was 10 years ago. And that hasn't been caught up with by our legislation or our regulations.
And without a register, however effective that may turn out to be, is it going to be possible, would it be possible to vet and screen people from a country like China that wants to get close to people of political and other influence in Britain?
I think you have to define which areas are of critical national interest, and certainly that has been attempted in this National Security Investment Act, but it's only just sort of teething at the moment. It hasn't really kicked in, and I think it defines something like 16 sectors of the economy which are sensitive. These are areas of the economy where we are not allowed to invest in China, and I don't believe China should be allowed to invest here. But in a broader sense, we do need to have a balanced relationship. We need to trade with China. We need to do diplomatic business with China. We just have to sensitize everyone to the threat that comes with that.
All right. Christopher Steele, a former MI6 officer, thank you.